Heard of the television series That's Incredible? And if you have, did you watch Saturday Night Live last week? They did a takeoff of the series, The Incredible People, and everybody they brought out to interview, they would fall over and say, "That's incredible." And it was a very funny series, and those two words are interesting because I'd written them down under a title of subjects I want to do on tapes for you that would get lost in the ordinary files. I called it That's Incredible. But everything in the news is incredible today. Maybe we should change the series from World Watchers to just That's Incredible. I like that line in the play The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas where she sings, "I started out poor and ended up an outcast." There was a sentence in an interview regarding G. Gordon Liddy in the Los Angeles Times, written by his buddy John Dean, and he compared G. Gordon Liddy's book to one similar to the kind that Hitler would write. He said it's all right if you like Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, but John Dean isn't much better than G. Gordon Liddy. They're both of the same fabric. And there's a sentence in here describing their circumstances that I think just about summarizes everything they did. John Dean said, "I know what it's like to discover that your most bankable asset is not your education or your ability, but intimate knowledge about a sordid slice of history." End quote. Those fellows worked hard through school, grammar school, prep schools, high schools, college, law school, went into the Treasury Department, the FBI, attorneys for the President of the United States, and now they're outcasts of a sort in society. They make money, they sell books, and they are pulling in a lot of wealth, as are all the other people involved in the Watergate affair, the Korea Gate, the assassinations. They have this mobility that moves up. If they're not murdered, they're paid off, and what it turns out to be is that you make the most money with what you know and not with the education you got. They can't use their law degrees. They were taken from them. But as John Dean said, again, I know what it's like to discover that your most bankable asset is not your education or your ability, but intimate knowledge about a sordid slice of history. There also is a picture of G. Gordon Liddy with his wife, Frances. He talks about choosing her in his book. He writes about the selection of his wife, that before he married her, he had her checked out a la Adolf Hitler style. Hitler would check out the marriages. He checked out with the FBI to see if she was all right. The only trouble with that way to seek a partner is that she didn't check out G. Gordon to find out that he was eating these dead rats, killing them and peeling them and eating them. She didn't check him out, but he checked her out. It's still a sexist society where the man can check out the woman, but she can't get access to the information that would tell her he's a loony bat. There's a new book advertised, a full half page of the entire page of Washington Post, or 3/4 of the page. You can't help but miss it. It's May the 13th, 1980. I don't have the book. This is just the advertisement. It's written by a woman, Barbara Betcherman. Maybe you've heard of it. The book is called Suspicions. But the full picture, there's about 10 inches, a huge picture of the head of the Statue of Liberty holding the flame. It looks very much like the torch of John Kennedy also. She's holding that flame in her hand, and out of the smoke is coming the Nazi swastika. And then in large black letters, 1/3 of the advertisement, it states, "Someone has already chosen the next American president, and it isn't us." And the swastika is there symbolizing that Nazi Germany has selected. And of course, this is what I maintained since my first published article in 1970, that Reagan was the selected man by the Nazi group that took over this country at the end of World War I, actually, and tightened each little knot until we're at the state that we're in today. Down below, there are some more descriptions of the book, the new super thriller about an international conspiracy to change the course of history and the one woman who can stop it. It's a novel about a woman whose husband disappears from the home. The woman is a lawyer. She tries to find him. Her children and her family are in danger, and she tries to solve this mystery. Now, this is a mystery story. I could transpose the years from 1919 to the present and put in the names of the actual people. I don't read many novels, but I want to read this because this is exactly what happened to the United States. It's been gone since Herbert Hoover had dual citizenship with England and the United States. and they armed Europe against the Soviet Union and armed the United States to the point of the inflation, bankruptcy, and so forth to regain control of the minerals, wealth, and power of the vast Soviet Union. Along those lines, you have to read the book, The Plot to Seize the White House. I did a tape on that a long time ago on KLRB. I don't know if I have one in this cassette series. I'll have to review it for you a little bit. It was written by Jules Archer in 1973, dedicated to George Seldes and John Spivak for their courageous dedication to truth. And this book is about a Major General, Smedley Darlington Butler. He had gotten the Medal of Honor twice, and he was convinced that the military in the United States was a cover for corporations, that the entire Pentagon military system was only working for the huge multinational corporations, and that they were making a fascist puppet out of Franklin Roosevelt. This is the time when the huge corporations were making puppets out of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, putting them into power. Along with the Vatican and other church organizations, the heads of states were figures of states, and the armies were provided for them, the media, the propaganda, the movies, the whole cross-section of the way we get our information. Were working to make these heads of states puppets for the multinational corporations. In the book Aftermath or Operation Sunrise, there's a continuation of the role of Hermann Goering trying to persuade Franklin Roosevelt to go along with Western Europe to invade Russia as soon as the war was over and not have a peace treaty with the Soviet Union, that this was their real threat and menace, and now that they had conquered Germany, rearm again and go up against the Soviet Union. The White House is controlled by the multinationals and the Pentagon. If they couldn't do it with Franklin Roosevelt, they certainly succeeded with Harry Truman and the atomic bomb, and starting the National Security Council with Reinhard Gehlen, and changing our government as soon as World War II is over. And then the Marshall Plan and the rearming of Germany, the weapons and the food plan were identical to the efforts after World War I to supply army to the Tsarists and the refugees from the Soviet Union who were ready to help fight to go back one more time to get their homeland. Not that they were corrupt enough in their homeland, but that didn't matter, that what was there was theirs, and they want war to get it back. Last week I talked about Melvin Belli being the attorney for Mrs. Hermann Goering and representing the Goering family with the yacht of Goering, that Belli was the attorney for Jack Ruby. He also was the attorney in Altamont for the Rolling Stones, for the group that was a counterintelligence operation against the rock festivals. He worked with the Hells Angels that have worked with organized crime and the bicycle gangs, and getting articles about the mob and the bicycle gangs in New York City. They're linked to the high-up politicians on the East Coast and the West Coast, and are a very strong Nazi organization. They plowed into the anti-war people out here, and I followed the Hells Angels very closely on the West Coast, working with the Treasury Department, Sonny Barger, and his police informants. And I'll do more on that later, but Melvin Belli represented Jack Ruby, Errol Flynn, closely associated to Errol Flynn and his Gestapo team, and Mrs. Goering. Last week, I mentioned the book that I'm reading, Hitler's Secret Life, The Mysteries of the Eagle Nest. That's the one by Glenn Infield, and it's just fascinating. There's a picture of Hitler with Eva Braun, his woman friend, and a little girl, and under the title, this is from the National Archives, I suppose in Washington, D.C., under the title of the picture, it said that many persons thought that this little girl belonged to Hitler and Eva, but this wasn't so. But there is evidence that Hitler did have a child. The child was born December the 1st, 1939, by Goering's wife, Emma. She had several names, and I don't know if this is which wife this is, and I have to do more into the life of Goering now. But if Adolf Hitler had a child with Goering's wife, and Goering's yacht is for sale, and Melvin Belli represents the Goering family, does he represent Adolf Hitler's son? Does a man who worked with the Warren Commission on the assassination of John Kennedy, who's been a political activist lawyer for the far right all this time, does he represent the heir to Adolf Hitler? Now, if Goering and Mrs. Goering and Adolf had a child, and this is acknowledged, and the date of the birth is recorded, and if Melvin Belli is their attorney. It would be interesting to go into this a little farther and just see if the son is around living with Mrs. Goering. They now acknowledge that they have many valuable art paintings. Goering gobbled up a lot of art treasures around the world, and now that she's passed away, they're going into the art treasures, but the titles of those pictures haven't been revealed yet, if they ever will be. Now for an incredible story. I'm going to take you on a journey I promised about 2 months ago and never got back to it. There's a lot of current news, but this story is incredible, and I don't want it to go beyond another week before I share it with you, because that's incredible. In 1976, going back to 1976, there was a newspaper article, November the 17th. Sunken ship may hold $5 billion treasure. This is from the Associated Press, and it tells about China getting permission to search for a ship that was sunk up to $5 billion in diamonds, art objects, cash, gold, and other metals. The name of the ship was the Aura Maru. I'll put it on the printed sheet for you. And it was sunk a few miles off the China coast. The salvage group that was supposed to get this ship up is represented by John Lindbergh, the son of Charles Lindbergh, and this is important because of the cargo on the ship and the connections of Lindbergh to the Tsarist Russia, to Herbert Hoover, to J. Edgar Hoover, to Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering, Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and the team. The father of John Lindbergh worked closely, and he also, again, is described in this book, his relationships to the Nazis, many, many books, but Hitler's secret life. Now, John Lindbergh works with astronaut Scott Carpenter to salvage the ship. Scott Carpenter represents NASA, which again was formed by Werner von Braun, a Nazi, and Mr. Dornberger, two Nazi war criminals that came over here from Germany to work on the space rocket ship. So one of the astronauts from NASA, Scott Carpenter, is working with the son of Charles Lindbergh, and they have the salvage rights to go into the Formosa Straits. Now, the Awa Maru was identified as a hospital ship. The Red Cross gave it that insignia, knowing that it wasn't a hospital ship, and they put 2,009 souls aboard. That's the way the article describes them. 2,009 people were put there as a cover for what was on the ship. Only one person survived. The captain, the skipper, survived, and the case was closed later. He got off free, and 2,009 people went under. And it had the flag of the Red Cross, and it went out as a hospital ship, knowing it wasn't, and it was sunk April the 1st, 1945. This is May, many years later. It was given safe passage by the Red Cross, and actually, this is what they had on that ship, was strategic metal, gold, diamond, taken from occupied territory that was determined in a year of research. Now, the occupied territory was that when the Soviet Union went into power, many people exiled with diamonds, gold, minerals, jewels, art treasures, and went to Manchuria. They fled to Manchuria. Then, when they were afraid that Russia would take Manchuria and capture this wealth, the Japanese had gone into Manchuria. The history of why they wanted Manchuria is very important. There was an extreme amount of wealth, minerals, golds, and so forth, taken out of Tsarist Russia, and they were afraid that when the Western Front closed in Europe in 1945, that Russia would move towards Japan and get their toe into the Asian part of the continent. And this, according to many documents, is the reason that the atomic bomb fell so quickly in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The Russians had gone into Europe and into Germany in 1945. In April and May, the war was over in Europe in 1945. And in August, the atomic bomb was dropped quickly in Nagasaki and Hiroshima to end all chance of Russia getting their foot into Asia, and they would have been there for a long time, as they are in Eastern Europe today. But this extreme amount of wealth was taken. The Japanese were afraid that, of course, it would be conquered if the Russians came their way like they went through Europe. So on April the 1st, as the Allies were moving in on Berlin, this ship left Japan and went down off of China and was sunk. Now, the commander of this ship, there was a submarine Queenfish that was alongside of this ship, and it was silhouetted. It looked like a destroyer. There was an excuse, there was some fog. But they torpedoed it, and then first account of this ship that came out in 1976 was that they torpedoed it exactly, that the accuracy, this is a direct quote from an Associated Press story going back a few years ago, 1976, they torpedoed it in 2 minutes, and 2,009 souls died except for the skipper. He lived, and the commander, Mr. Laughlin, was court-martialed. They said he was negligent. The United States apologized to Japan, and that ended it. Japan had only had a few sick people on there. They were transporting out of Japan on the boat anyway. Now, in San Diego, a newspaper story broke that the Salvage and Diving Company, an international corporation, has their offices in Hong Kong, but the corporation is headed by a man named Bill Button of San Diego, and that Mr. Scott Carpenter, the astronaut, is a shareholder in this project, and the project started in 1965 to begin to bring up this wealth that was sunk outside of China. Now, the captain, Mr. Bennett, who was the navigator of the Queenfish, the man who helped sink this Queenfish, the man who survived it just got a slap on the wrist, but the man who sank it became head of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego. That's where the son of Charles Lindbergh works, John Lindbergh, and Scott Carpenter, the astronaut, worked at Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego. So the captain of the ship that sank this Awa Maru became the head of the School of Oceanography. Now, they claim that there is $241 million in ingot gold. That was at the old rates. Keep whatever gold was worth in 1976 or 65, you can add a little bit to it. 12 tons of platinum in those days worth approximately $58 million, bales and bales of paper currency that evidently were printed by that Operation Bernhardt that they were getting out of Europe and sending to Japan to use to resurge the Nazis and set us up for World War III. 40 cases of art treasures plundered throughout Asia. Now, these were what the Japanese took out of the Manchuria area, 40 cases of art, 150,000 carats of uncut diamonds are on the ship. They were in 3 safes, 2,000 tons of tungsten worth $4 million in those days, 3,000 tons of tin worth $21 million, and 2,000 tons of lead worth $1.4 million, 800 tons of titanium worth $2.5 million. The rough figure on this story that came out in 76, which I saved, came to approximately $5 billion worth of valuables, if you could give it a price, that were purposely sunk. The man who sunk it became head of the School of Oceanography. They knew where the ship was. One man jumped the ship and lived, and then a former astronaut and the son of Lindbergh worked with the school with the man who sunk this freighter. Now, one other article came out in 1976 about this ship, status of possible $5 billion ship treasure still in doubt. This was an Associated Press story, again telling about the millions of dollars of tungsten, lead, and so forth, platinum and diamonds, and $5 billion. But a follow-up, Associated Press said the status is in doubt. Now we jump to April 1977. That was 3 years ago, just 3 years ago. Sunken freighter may hold riches. A sunken Japanese freighter may be holding $5 billion of riches. It refers to Bill Button and Scott Carpenter, again, the astronauts. The ship was sunk a few miles off of China, and Mr. Bennett, who was a lieutenant 31 years ago of the submarine Queenfish, who sank the Awa Marie, stated the value of the $5 billion or more, the treasures that are on this ship. Nobody except our crew knows the exact location of the Awa Maru. That is a direct quote from the gentleman who run the operation that we're going to bring out the wealth on that ship. Now, that was in April of 77, and also in 77 there began to be articles about the Glomar Explorer, and I have many of those. That's the ship that you taxpayers built for millions of dollars millions and millions of dollars. It was built under the front of the Central Intelligence Agency by Howard Hughes organization. There's one article, April the 12th, this is 1977, the same time that the story came out again about the Awa Maru, that the Glomar Explorer can be converted into a scientific deep-sea fish for oil drilling. It's used by the Central Intelligence Agency, and it also can be converted to get minerals and other uses under the sea. Another article, a report, the Glomar lifted a Soviet sub, but it goes on to say that there is expectations that the Glomar will be used for underwater minerals. And I believe it had more to do with gathering up this wealth of billions of dollars, building the Glomar Explorer under the Hughes organization, than it did reviving a few dead Russians on a submarine and then saying a prayer and then throwing them back in the water for burial again in the water. We never saw those people. They didn't bring the bodies back. They brought in a priest at the time that the story of the Soviet sub came out, and I don't believe half of that. And I believe more that the taxpayers of this country spent hundreds of millions of dollars for the Glomar Explorer to be built for the CIA, for the Hughes organization being the cover, and then private corporations make the money to bring up the wealth after we pay to build the ship. The money doesn't go back to the United States. It goes to private hands to fund what they want to use it for. There was another article about the Glomar when it came out. A Hawaiian newspaper reported that all the stories about recovering the sunken submarine are disinformation, covering up the true top-secret mission of the Howard Hughes mystery ship. That came out in 1977. Another article about the crew on the Glomar Explorer eating steak and lobster, having a ball, watching the movie Deep Throat, and Richard Nixon knew of the ship's surreptitious mission to recover a sunken Russian submarine. Well, Richard Nixon was selected for presidency by Howard Hughes under the space satellite system, the rearming after World War II. Nixon was a cover for Nazis coming into this country, for the rebuilding of the space stations and operations such as the Glomar. And I believe that Richard Nixon knows why this ship was built and the sinking of the Awa Maru. Another article about treasure hunt for the Glomar. This came out in 1975. The Glomar Explorer, $30 million treasure of gold outside of Catalina Island. They were going to go for a ship that another person knew had sunken there, a Spanish galleon. And the question was the Glomar built to bring up $30 million there? Well, there's $30 million there and $5 billion outside of the coast of China. And the Glomar was used as a front for bringing up wealth from the ocean, and then the wealth can be put in the hands of private people, or worse yet, it can be used to fund the neo-Nazi, Nazi resurgence, or the Nazi continuation all over the world. Well, there was an article, just bringing you up to date now, 2 months ago, March 22nd, 1980, United States research ship departs on a joint marine study with China. San Diego, the same place of the School of Oceanography, a government research vessel began a historic journey, 20,000 miles, a cooperative venture between the United States and China, and the excuse, they said, is to get insight into those forces that gave birth to ancient rivers that once drained a submerged North America. Now, I can't believe that China and the United States, the oceanographers, are going to go this far to study how American rivers started before America was even a continent. I think this is a cover story for a venture between the United States and China. Then another story, February 27, 1980, to update it. Diver finds treasure on sunken ship. A diver who once hoped to find a Japanese ship that went down in World War II said the Chinese have found the sunken vessel and are recovering tons of gold, diamonds, precious metals. They are raising tin ingots. The tin alone is worth $57 million. There's 3,000 metric tons of tin. That's a fraction of the cargo. 12 tons of platinum, 2,000 tons of tungsten, 2,000 tons of lead, 150,000 carats of uncut diamonds, 1 million troy ounces of gold, 6 tons of gold coins. And this small article, which is only about 4 inches long, says on April the 1st, the Awa Maru, disguised as a hospital ship, but laden with precious booty, was sent from occupied Asia to the Sea of China. Now, the United States and Japan must have known that they would be together once, fighting the Soviet Union, protecting their wealth, calling a halt to the war on our west coast, their east coast, and getting ready to use the funds against the Soviet Union someday. The trilateralists, Germany, Japan, and the United States, saw the handwriting on the wall in 1943 that they couldn't win the Soviet Union this time, and they took these wealth and treasures out of Japan to China. Now the question is, with the China card and arming China, if China is handed just 57 million of tin and all of this wealth, this would explain how China could rearm, have money for duplicating airplanes and atomic bombs and weapons. China may have been given this ship instead of cash because all of a sudden American corporation in San Diego was going to have all this wealth and build a ship to bring it up, the Glomar Explorer, and now we very nicely hand it to China, who last week was saying that they have accepted the reality that they have to go to war against Russia someday. Now, Guy Wright had an article on the Awa Maru, May the 1st, 1980, that was in the newspaper, an update on it. He's a writer for the San Francisco Examiner. This is what he said. 35 years ago today, the skipper of an American submarine made a ghastly mistake. I don't think it was a mistake. I think he's covering up. It said they looked at his ship and fired 4 torpedoes and sunk it. That was true. Only one survivor lived. That was true. The ship went down with 207,000 passengers. True. The largest death toll in the Marines. It was international agreement. It would be a Red Cross ship. The U.S. apologized and the commander was released. That was true. They blamed the sinking on fog, that it's changed course. It was low in the water. None of that was true. They had to have arrangements that would sink. He goes on to say it was filled with gold bullion, treasures plundered from occupied territories. The ship, the wreck, is in 100 feet of water. They've recovered 158 of the bodies. Then Guy Wright asked the question, how about the treasure? The Awa Maru vanished once again into a fog of official silence. Now, maybe you've seen something in your Eastern papers about it. Maybe you haven't. I've kept articles on it, and this is all I have on it. Now, all of these billions of dollars, millions of dollars, according to this one recent story, are in the hands of China. And yet the facilities for bringing it up were made in the United States. And here you have the astronaut, Lindbergh's son, the Japanese in collusion with us, letting it cover as a Red Cross ship, taking that out, timing it, and bringing it up at this time. And the wealth of that has gone evidently to China. That would give them a lot of money and a lot of leverage on the market to disperse to fund their operations, so that we cannot be accused of funding or sending all of the arms to China against the Soviet Union for World War III. They can convert a lot of this wealth and use it for what they need and prepare to have that war against the Soviet Union that Japan wants, Germany wants, and bait China, use them as our ally, and now the wealth is in the hands of the Chinese government. If we had access to this, I don't think we handed it over without a clause. And I believe the story of the Awa Maru is one of the most interesting stories of how the School of Oceanography was formed and how the man who sunk the ship was the head of the school out here in La Jolla. That, I believe, and I think you'll agree, is incredible. This is an incredible story. If there's more that comes later, I'll update it with you. But as far as I have information now, this is the essence of the Awa Maru, what happened, and I believe that all of this came from the Japanese capturing of Manchuria, Manchuria being the repository of the wealth that came out when the czars and their family were deposed and the Soviet Union took over the government. In 1975, there were hearings with Mr. Colby, the director of the CIA, on the Russian submarine in the CIA, and they stressed national security, and they wouldn't talk about the Russian submarine. And I do believe the Glomar, as I said, had more to do with this wealth that they would take for private profit and for paying off people to be our allies than it had to do with bringing up a few dead Russians.
Who said life was a roller coaster? Who said life was sweet surprise? Who said life was a circus poster? Don't even start. Were you?
This is Mae Brussell, and it's side 2 of tape number 442, May 23rd, 1980. I want to start out this side of the tape with an article by Maxine Cheshire in the Washington Post. She is doing a very good job, even better than Jack Anderson, and he could do a lot more, in exposing certain things that are going on in Washington, D.C. Every Sunday she has a column, and I have many of them to share with you, and I've never had time to get around to them. But the one she had this last week on Mr. Brzezinski is one of the most important she's ever written. The background, before I go into her article, I don't know how many of you have the article I wrote in 1972 on why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped. If you don't have it, you can order it from me. It's $1 plus postage, because it goes into the possibility of a military coup in 1972, which didn't have to be achieved because they got Nixon out with that piece of Scotch tape at the Watergate Hotel and the tapes that they used to trap him. But there were plans, the Whitehouse plumbers and the Pentagon, to murder him, to have a physical coup similar to the one that happened to Allende in Chile. And the rope that was tightening around the presidency from way back, going back to the book The Plot to Seize the White House, the physical control, the psychological control, and the military were all in power in the White House at the time of Watergate. And E. Howard Hunt, as part of the plumbers team, had his own pistol in the desk there, his own guns, and James McCord was head of the 16-man emergency unit of the Pentagon for security in case of a military takeover or coup d'etat. He worked with the CIA, the FBI, and the Pentagon, was a liaison to the Pentagon there. Well, this last week, Maxine Cheshire had an article about Brzezinski. And you have to understand that Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski represents the Nazi, German, Polish intent to destroy this country from the outside, identical to that advertisement, if not the theme, because I haven't read the book yet, that I mentioned on the other side of this tape. And as opposed to him in the power structure are the red, white, and blue American conservatives, who don't consider themselves fascists, but conservatives against the fascist Nazi element. There's a struggle at the top, and Brzezinski represents the Galen Nazi fascist group that controls the National Security Council. Now, she made comment, in fact, by the fact that disregarding normal White House channels, this is what Maxine Cheshire wrote, the National Security Advisor, Mr. Brzezinski, personally worked out what is an unprecedented bureaucratic arrangement whereby his bodyguards are not the Secret Service. He has a special deputy that he made U.S. Marshals because he's defended and guarded by the Defense Department, Brzezinski, evidently the only one in the entire White House, since last November when the hostages were taken. And he mentions that he is guarded, and this is interesting for you researchers, by, in quotes, the little-known Defense Investigative Service. Now, the Defense Investigative Service, she says, is that agency that normally does routine personnel background checks. That is known to the researchers who have the Torbett document, and if you don't have it, you can obtain it from research. I've given you that address. I'll give it to you again. The Torbett document is about the Defense Industry Security Command, the assassination team, the Nazis that came to this country, that small organization under the cloak of doing routine personnel background checks. Now, you don't see DISC, Defense Industry Security Command, in the news very much, and the title might have been changed to Defense Investigative Service. It's still DIS with the C eliminated, and the Torbett document came out in 1970. So it's the DIS, and it is the same agency that does background checks, and no one is legally authorized to carry a gun in this agency. They're not supposed to, but this is the agency that's formed by the Nazis that came from Europe and the white Russian community, the Tsarists. They were supposed to do background checks on people working in the defense industry, and because they can't carry guns, Brzezinski had his guards sworn in under the title of the U.S. Marshals because they're armed and they surround him. Under a law that allows other government jurisdictions to detail employees to the White House for special duty, I'm reading this article, the Defense Department is underwriting the cost of protecting Mr. Brzezinski, even though he's not paid by the Defense Department. Zbigniew Brzezinski is not under salary to the Defense Department, but the people working for him are salaried from the defense. Brzezinski, according to White House Special Assistant U.A. Carter Jr., made complicated arrangements for bodyguards personally with Secretary of Defense Harold Brown. Harold Brown ordered them for Brzezinski. No one knows why. There's no reason Brzezinski's life was threatened. President Carter felt it was necessary for Brzezinski to be guarded. The Secret Service then could have done it under the law. They did it for Henry Kissinger, and the head of the defense before, Major General Brent Scowcroft, had no bodyguards at all. The Secret Service said it was never consulted on whether to provide security for Brzezinski. Now, this is important because if there's going to be a coup, if Carter were to be murdered and they were to blame a leftist or a black cook in the White House, or one of these programmed people, such as the person that killed Alan Lowenstein recently, Mr. Sweeney, or this Mrs. Harris who killed Dr. Tarnower, these various people that come in and effectively do these murders unexpectedly, a woman, a civil rights activist, and so forth. If there were a conflict between the Secret Service, and the Defense Department is in the White House where it's never been before, and the entourage is paid by the defense, and if there were a conflict there and they had to pull guns fast or whatever, Brzezinski would be in there with his armed men. The Secret Service has always taken care of the White House and given protective training and so forth. Now, according to this article, the White House Military Affairs knew nothing about these bodyguards. They were brought in by him until it was a fait accompli. U.A. Carter Jr. is Jimmy Carter's cousin. He's in charge of the staff that normally would assign Secret Service to Brzezinski or a request for bodyguards. If Brzezinski didn't ask Mr. Carter, I need people to protect me, we have an Iranian crisis, I got a death threat. In other words, I don't think it is a protective thing about Brzezinski. I think it is an offensive act of the Pentagon with armed guards that if anything comes down, Brzezinski is there and his guards are there to shoot or take over. I think it is an attack because it isn't anything that went through any normal channels that anyone knew about. Jimmy Carter in the White House has his cousin as a liaison to the Secret Service, but he also controls the Military Affairs Office through the Pentagon. He provides the White House with limousines, communication experts, helicopters, jet plane pilots, boat crews, even the stewards and valets. So the question is, does Brzezinski also have his own communication like James McCord did, separate from the Secret Service to keep track of their move? Ms. Cheshire wrote that Mr. Carter, Jimmy's cousin, had very tight control since he took over the White House. They originally took away luxury automobiles, a limousine of Brzezinski. Brzezinski got his staff back. He said for security reasons he has to have portal-to-portal transportation. He has to be in touch with his staff on a telephone that goes with his car. So the question is, does his telephone line have a different line than other telephone lines, that he has to have his own car, his own chauffeur, and who is Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski? She said that the White House said that they first learned of his bodyguard when they spotted them one day, and they called the Military Affairs Office and said, who are these people? Now, they don't give their names or how many there are, whether there's 2 or 10 or 12 traveling with him, which is serious. And Mr. Carter fired the previous head of military affairs because he wanted a friend, Marvin Beeman, in charge of a crackdown to protect Jimmy Carter, his cousin, to make sure that no one was working, that they weren't aware in advance of every person who wasn't working for them. And all of a sudden, in the White House, there are what they refer to as these people. And there was confusion about the bodyguards and how they carried the guns legally. They're not supposed to have them. This group, this defense, investigative service isn't armed, so they had them sworn in as U.S. Marshals so that they legally could be carrying guns. So legally they're in the White House armed. They did a week of inquiries, and the Defense Department denied knowing about it and then admitted that the bodyguards had been marshaled since November. Yesterday morning, an inquiry was made to William Hall, director of the U.S. Marshals, who said, you know as much about it as I do. I only learned about it this morning. Then he admitted that back in November, the Defense Department supplied these people and that the marshals are armed. So Zbigniew Brzezinski maintains his own radio and his own telephones and his own guards and his own marshals out of the Defense Department inside the White House, and even the deepest White House security didn't know who these people were, and there's never been anything like it before. This is terribly important because of the power Brzezinski has, and how momentarily, with riots in the streets or releasing of a bomb or various accidents happening in the United States, or if the election were too close, Jimmy Carter could be offed by one of these crazies that gets in and has dinner and then just shoots. And Brzezinski and his gang are a secret army inside the Secret Service. Even the president's cousin couldn't screen them out. I mentioned on a tape several weeks ago that the Iranian crisis was subverted. World War III was temporarily put off, that they were planning a shooting war and taking Tehran and the hostages, but that the leak came out of Hong Kong that tipped various people off, and that there was a sabotage to break this, and I believe it was from people who did not want us on the verge of World War III. That's why Brzezinski's wings were clipped then, and Muskie was put in hurriedly to cool matters down. Well, there was an article this week, April the 14th, 1980, an Associated Press story. There were two stories. One, that the group that tried to get the hostages, the aborted attempt, had stopped in London on their way to Egypt and then to the Middle East. There's an article, Associated Press, lawmakers in London allege that there is a secrecy leak at their spy base. This is from London. The British are pressing for an inquiry into published reports of a serious lapse, a security lapse, of British base in Hong Kong, and the allegations that the government is covering up the problem. The London Daily Mirror and the New Statesman quoted an official at the base saying that top-secret documents have been stolen from the communications monitoring system. And I thought I'd bring that up to you because I said it was from Hong Kong that the leak came, and evidently they're trying to find out who aborted this crisis and set the American government back from proceeding with their plans for World War III. Did you see Spiro Agnew on television giving an interview with Barbara Walters? You know, at the time of Watergate, in addition to the 30 or 40 witnesses that were murdered closely after the Watergate arrest, and I did that one article on the 30 witnesses, James McCord was threatened to be killed, and G. Gordon Liddy has said how he orders killings from inside the prison. He can order prisoners killed. He has that power with his guards and so forth to order killings, and G. Gordon Liddy thought he would be killed. E. Howard Hunt thought he would be killed. McCord thought he would be killed. Agnew claims assassination fears prompted him to get a gun permit, and I've mentioned before how Spiro Agnew was afraid of his life, and I believe Richard Nixon got Agnew out because Nixon was afraid of his life. But it's an interesting point. Agnew said he wrote a book and he dedicated it to Frank Sinatra, and Barbara Walters says, why not your wife and your children? And he said, no, Frank Sinatra bailed me out. I owed money, $200,000 the IRS. I owed other money, and Frank Sinatra was my buddy. He came up with the money. Now that's interesting because this last week there was an article about Frank Sinatra, and we know the allegations of his links from his early career to organized crime. But in the San Jose Mercury, there's a question and answer period, that parade every week. And the question came out in 1963. Frank Sinatra gave up his gambling license in Nevada for housing the late Sam Giancana, the alleged head of the Chicago Mafia. Why does he want a new Nevada license at this time? And the answer was probably because he's going to apply to the state of New Jersey, where Caesar's Casino is. He wants to have gambling licenses in New Jersey and operate a resort there in New Jersey, and they won't grant him the license unless Nevada clears his previous record. So Frank Sinatra, who worked with Sam Giancana worked with Central Intelligence Agency, with Robert Mayhew, the Howard Hughes Organization again, and John Rosselli and Sheffield Edwards of the CIA, and William Harvey, the CIA. Sam Giancana worked with Jack Ruby, the Chicago connections, the Dallas connections of organized crime. Sam Giancana, part of the assassination hit teams and death squads. In '63, the year of the Kennedy assassination, being housed and closely associated with Frank Sinatra. And then a few years later, Spiro Agnew gets in trouble, and here is a man linked with the assassination hit teams, and Agnew goes to him, and Sinatra puts up the money which is easy to get from organized crime, and bail Spiro Agnew out. So James Earl Ray wrote for Look magazine right after he was charged with assassinating Reverend Martin Luther King that it had to be done in an election year. And it was the assassination of Reverend King in April of 1968 that caused the riots and the burning of Newark, Detroit, Watts, and around the country, various cities, riots of the blacks. And out of that emerged the governor of Maryland, Spiro Agnew. At the convention, when they asked who's Agnew, later he became a household word against the anti-war protesters, the blacks, the minorities, and so forth. But when he's in trouble at Watergate, when he can't quite get to the presidency, he was the selected president to follow Richard Nixon, and then Ronald Reagan was selected to follow him. When he was pushed out of power, he knew where to go, and he went right to Frank Sinatra, and they've been close ever since. I want to do a detailed tape for you soon on Libya, Gaddafi, Jimmy Carter, the narcotics connections, Billy Carter, Robert Vesco. That can of worms deserves one whole hour tape. But in the meantime, I received 2 wonderful articles from a listener in New Jersey. I haven't seen them here at all, from the Courier Post. This is a Gannett newspaper from New Jersey, South New Jersey, and there are 2 articles about Robert Vesco, May the 11th and May the 12th, a 2-part series on the fact that the FBI was planning to kill Robert Vesco, to drug him, bring him to this country, and that he is bringing in the Carter administration. I've said that there is a close link of Vesco to Carter, Billy Carter, and so forth. And now he believes that this operation, it's called Operation Kingfish, is prepared to kill him. They don't want him to testify before grand juries. They don't want him to make the connections that he knows. And now he's in trouble. He said, why do you think there's no indictment of a grand jury probe of a $10 million payoff to the Carter administration officials? He wouldn't elaborate, but he said, they want me back in the United States in a box. It's called Operation Kingfish. It was concocted in Miami with the FBI. They planned to lure Vesco to an aircraft, pretend they had engine trouble, make an emergency landing, arrest him, drug him, put him in a Florida hospital and drug him and silence him because aides to President Carter were bribed to clear up the Vesco connections, the legal problems, and they don't want him to give testimony, and he claims that there's an elaborate plan to kill him. And I'll do more details on it, but the killing of primary witnesses and drugging them is so common that it's unbelievable that this has been going on for so long and has been so well concealed and isn't carried on a national wire service story. I didn't get anything in my newspapers of this operation to kill him before he breaks the links of the $10 million payoff to Jimmy Carter and that gang. But the Libya, Gaddafi, Vesco, Billy Carter, narcotics connections has a lot to do with the trouble in the Middle East right now. As I say, I'll get back to it. But speaking of murders and deaths, he claims that he'll be the next done in as they want him home in a box. This article has details of Vesco's operation, Charles Kerbo, Jimmy Carter's attorney, Hamilton Jordan, the chief of staff, and of course Jordan is thick with Trujillo down in Panama, the president of Panama, and the narcotic connection that I've mentioned before. There's pictures of John Mitchell from the Watergate era, and Maurice Stans, and Vesco claims that they got off. They got favoritism of the court and with their political shenanigans, and that the scapegoat is going to be to bring Vesco home, kill him, and silence the link of Robert Vesco and his connections to the high-up officials, both of the Nixon administration and the Jimmy Carter administration. And speaking of being brought home dead in a box, the Courier Post from New Jersey also had a large 2-page article about a plane crash that we're not getting much on the West Coast. No information is coming here. Former Camden Democratic Chairman James Joyce, 50 years old, was killed. He was one of 4 people killed in a plane crash that left Washington, D.C. and was going to Atlantic City. He was from the Caribbean. He'd moved down there. He had been indicted on various charges by the grand jury of soliciting bribes, and he was involved with that can of worms New Jersey casino mob and was flying into New Jersey for the weekend. When the plane crashed, they found passports that were badly charred, but none of them matched the names of the people on the airplane, and the police refused to elaborate on that. They were using aliases or they had other passports, and those weren't the proper names of the people on the plane. One of the people on the plane that died was a John Arthur George Smith McCartney, described as the chief minister of the Caribbean. There's two small islands in the Caribbean, the Grand Turks and the Caicos Island. They belong to the British. They're 100 miles north of Haiti, and they're going to, British government's going to release those soon and make them independent. And this article says the State Department said that McCartney was seeking the U.S. Coast Guard to help stem marijuana and cocaine smuggling traffic that is used in his island. The island is used for refueling on the way to Florida from Colombia, and there's a considerable amount of marijuana and quaaludes coming in through those islands. The main industry has been fishing and tourism. Mr. McCartney, who wants to stop the narcotics traffic, is up for re-election at the end of the year, and the police and State Department wouldn't say what he had to do with Mr. Joyce. That they were doing business on that island, but they were flying from Washington, and the plane crashed. Some important people on this airplane that would affect the destiny of these islands outside of Haiti. On the Grand Turk Island, Dorothy McCartney, widow of the dead chief minister, said she didn't know Joyce or Bellis or why her husband would be with them. Her husband went to Washington last Saturday to speak to American officials about the independence of the island. She never understood what he was doing with the people that he was traveling with, and she didn't know anything about it. One of the deals he was cooking up in Washington was to make arrangements for an environmental dumping site where they would take an uninhabited island and dump hazardous waste and chemicals, and they had to get permission from Haiti, and they were hitting a snag with Haiti, and they were working this out. Also some hotel deals down in the Caribbean and so forth. But one man who was very important in the Abscam investigation, this James Joyce, important in the politics of New Jersey, and a mysterious group of passengers on his airplane were killed in this plane crash just at the time that one could spill the beans on the casino operations, who knows about the use of the islands for drug traffic and also knows about dangerous chemicals that they're planning to arrange to send down there. One article from the Courier Post said, police seeking the identity of a woman in the plane crash. Some of the passengers allegedly didn't know each other, which is hard to believe, but they don't know who the woman was. They're trying to identify a woman who went down in the plane with the former Camden, New Jersey County Democratic Chairman James Joyce and a British colonial official and a former official undersheriff from New Jersey. They can't find the name of the woman, and they decide to do an autopsy on the pilot, a former undersheriff, to see if he was drugged or given any chemicals. Now, it's interesting because usually these autopsies don't suggest that somebody poisoned the pilot before the plane went down. As I mentioned before, they had passports that didn't bear the names of the passengers that were supposed to be on the airplane. The flight originated in Washington, D.C., bound for Atlantic City. It would take about the next 4 weeks, 1 hour each week, to talk about important witnesses to the New Jersey casino story that are breaking now. There isn't even a moment's time to run through all the deaths that are happening in New York, New Jersey, and the Caribbean and Florida that are related to the Abscam story. Speaking of Abscam story, I thought it was shocking that the FBI chief from New York left there at the time after the Abscam story was developed and never stayed in the FBI long enough to prosecute the case. But even, again, more shocking, or I guess I'm pretty shock-proof, and I just say that's incredible, was an article last Sunday in the New York Times. The FBI chief in New York City was offered a job with the gambling casino in New Jersey. The head of the New York office of the FBI, Neil Welch, who is retiring now to take a job somewhere else, was offered a full-time job as a member of the New Jersey Gambling Control Commission, the Casino Control Commission. But I don't know why it's so shocking that an FBI man should move into the casinos and control who gets the gambling casinos in Nevada or New Jersey, when Intertel is made up of members of the Justice Department, the FBI, and CIA, and they control the Resorts International and the casinos in Vegas and Nevada and the Bahamas, made up of former federal investigators who have an inroad with organized crime, swindling, murder, narcotics, prostitution, extortion. It just seems obscene that Mr. Welch, who head of the Abscan investigation, should be offered a job with the Casino Commission at this time. When Kenneth MacDonald was alleged to have received $50,000 from an undercover agent who wanted a license in the casinos in New Jersey, and he was the vice chairman of this wonderful group, the Casino Control Commission. And now they asked Mr. Welch for that job. He's not going to take it. He's going to be over in Kentucky, which isn't too far away, working for their crime commission. But last week I talked about Mr. Sindona, Michael Sindona. Several weeks ago we did a tape that he was threatening to blackmail and tell the links of organized crime, his links, I guess, to the Gambino family, to the Vatican, the White House, and his operations, his financial international operations. He hinted that if he were prosecuted, that he would tell all. He was supposed to go for his sentencing. He's been convicted. He was supposed to go for sentencing of swindling $45 million out of the Franklin National Bank. The day before the sentencing, a guard watched him slice his wrist. Now, he isn't in critical condition because of the wrist. He has been lingering and probably holding his own because of a drug that was administered. Allegedly, he has a heart condition, and later it turned out he didn't. His lawyer said he didn't have a heart condition. I mentioned on the tape last week that the wrist cutting was only the excuse for putting him in a hospital, and once he got in the hospital, he would get very strong drugs that could very nicely take care of any expectations he has to talk about his affairs, any more than Jack Ruby could talk once he was in jail. Remember, G. Gordon Liddy says he can direct murders and so forth from jail, and I think it would be too obvious after the threat that Sindona made a few weeks ago to kill him 2 weeks later. But I assure you that when he gets out of the treatment center of the prison hospital or wherever he is, if he survives this, Sindona will not be very valuable as a canary. He's not going to write any book like the Valachi Papers and live and tell of the Vatican and the links to organized crime and where their money is going. So Mr. Sindona is in the hands of the chemical pharmaceutical concerns. According to the newspaper, it's the drugs that are holding him back. Otherwise, he would recover from the wrist. And to make sure he didn't die, a guard was watching him at the time that the wrist was tapped with a razor blade. And Sindona won't be the same person. He's had his little Borgia stick treatment. If you haven't seen the movie about the agents who go to a hospital and have the memory erased, he got his treatment, and we won't hear any more about those cold facts from Sindona. I doubt if we ever will now. You know, the killing of witnesses isn't anything new. It's just that I'm catching on, and that we've never had a proper course in the universities or high schools or even in homes on how to study history or read history books. I wish I could go back and do all of my work chronologically and put information into time slots and come out with a new kind of lens or view of history. I received another beautiful book this month, Prince Jack, The True Story of Jack the Ripper by Frank Spearing. And it tells about the investigation of Jack the Ripper and how in December of 1970, a magazine, The Criminologist, had a front page story, London, November the 1st, 1970. The Sunday Times expressed the belief that Jack the Ripper, the infamous London murderer of 100 years ago, was Edward Duke of Clarence, the grandson of Queen Victoria and the oldest brother of King George V. And it goes into the background of the criminologist's investigation into the murder that happened a long time ago of 5 prostitutes that were found dead and cut up, murdered and dismembered in a bizarre, terrible way. Well, the day after this story broke in the London Times, Dr. Stoll was interviewed on British Broadcasting, and in the article for the Criminologist, he referred to the Duke of Clarence just as the letter S, but he also identified the Ripper as Clarence in this interview. Then it goes on to say the pressure was put by Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard had a spokesman apologist come up and with a no comment. Meanwhile, Dr. Stoll, who was 80 years old, who was involved in this Jack the Ripper escapade or tragedy, was under political pressure. This is what the book says. So on November the 7th, he has a denial in the London Times. At no time did I associate with His Royal Highness the late Duke of Clarence or suggested the murder was of royal blood, signed Thomas E.A. Stoll. And then it says that after the letter was released, he dropped dead November the 8th, one day later in 1970. So the story broke about the tragedy of Jack the Ripper and the royal family. The doctor was put under pressure after it was released. He signed a denial on November the 7th, and then on November the 8th, he died one day later. True, he's 80 years old, and it's a lot of pressure, but he wasn't the murderer. He didn't do the murder, and it was 100 years before. So I don't know why he would drop dead, except that he did have access to the information. And as soon as he died, his son announced that he burned all of his father's papers that had to do with Jack the Ripper. He got rid of them and burned them. So this has been going on for a long time, the death of primary witnesses. It's just that it shocks me how close it follows the releasing of certain information and then the other person dying. We're out of time again. I wish I could put more on these tapes, but I can't. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. We'll just have to keep rolling along with the time we've got with That's Incredible for this week. Take care of yourselves, and I'll be back with some more scandals and stories for you on crime in the higher offices.